Take a look at this argument. All dogs are mammals. Therefore, some brown animals are mammals. Now, we did learn at the beginning of our course that it's possible to have an argument that has only one premise that leads with logical necessity to a particular conclusion. Is this that kind of argument? If we assume it's true that all dogs are mammals, would it have to also therefore be true that some brown animals are mammals? We say well, no, that doesn't seem to quite work. We might be able to draw a conclusion like this. If it's true that all dogs are mammals, then it would have to be true that some dogs are mammals by subalternation, if we're operating from the Aristotelian standpoint. After all, if we assume that every single dog is a mammal, and dogs actually exist, it would also have to be true that there's at least some dogs that are mammals. But that's not what the conclusion of this argument says. This conclusion makes a claim, or draws a conclusion about brown animals. And there's nothing in the argument that's been mentioned about brown animals before the conclusion. So what we have here is an argument that is missing a premise. There's a premise that's necessary for this conclusion that has been unstated. Okay, so if we assume that all dogs are mammals, what else would we also have to assume is true in order to draw the conclusion that some brown animals are mammals? We have to identify this missing premise in order to be able to evaluate the argument for validity and soundness. Okay, so what's the missing premise here? The missing premise is this: some brown animals are dogs. Now we've completely expressed the standard form categorical syllogism. If it's true that all dogs are mammal, and it's true, or we assume it's true, that some brown animals are dogs, then the conclusion, some brown animals are mammals, follows with logical necessity. What we're dealing with here is a type of argument called an enthymeme. An enthymeme is an argument that's expressible as a standard form categorical syllogism, but it has an unstated premise or conclusion. There is a part of the argument that hasn't been offered to us, but it's a part that's essential for the argument to work. And that's what we're going to be focused on in this thought primer. Take a look at this argument. No college dorms are fun places to live. Therefore, some tiny houses are not college dorms. And we look at this and we can see we've got a conclusion that's been drawn here. And it's a conclusion about some tiny houses and them not being college dorms. And that conclusion is being drawn from this statement about college dorms and fun places to live. But nothing about tiny houses has been mentioned before the conclusion. So we can see here that we're missing a premise. And the question for us is, well, how do I figure out what that missing premise is? And oftentimes, I'm going to be able to just intuit on my own. Well, this would have to be the other premise included in this argument in order for the conclusion to follow. And that's how I'm going to have to operate when I'm dealing with enthymemes that haven't yet been expressed with standard form categorical statements. But if I can translate the statements of the argument into standard form categorical statements, then I can figure out what the missing premise or conclusion is pretty easily. So I look here at my terms that have been offered to me in the argument as it's been presented. And I can see that I've got my major term, college dorms, mentioned up here in this premise. That tells me that this is the first premise of the argument. And I can see that the other two terms, the middle term, fun places to live, the term that's mentioned in the premises but not the conclusion, has only been mentioned once. And similarly, the minor term of the argument, tiny houses, the subject term of the conclusion, has also been mentioned only once. So I'm looking for another statement, a premise statement that includes the terms tiny houses and college dorms, because I know that a standard form categorical syllogism contains three terms that appear 2 times each in exactly the same way. And because college dorms has already appeared twice, and fun places to live in tiny houses have only appeared once, my statement needs to involve these 2 terms. So I left the S off of dorms here. Okay? Now, what I can do is I can use my knowledge of standard form categorical syllogisms and the rules to determine what exactly that statement should be. I can see here that I've got a negative premise and a negative conclusion. That's exactly what rule number 4 requires. But I keep in mind rule number 3, and rule number 3 says, you can't have 2 negative premises. So I know that the premise that I'm looking for here is going to have to be an affirmative premise. It's going to have to affirm something. It's either going to be an A statement or an E statement, and it's going to involve tiny houses and college dorms. When I look at my inventory of unconditionally valid forms, I'm going to see that the argument with the form E IO in figure 1 is a valid form of argument. And that means that my second premise is going to be some tiny houses are fun places to live. Okay, now enthymemes can also involve an unstated conclusion, right? And these are a little bit easier to intuit, right? Because we look at the offered premises and we can see what necessarily follows from those premises. So everyone who takes logic is awesome. You take logic. Therefore, yes, you're awesome, okay? So that's what we're going to focus on in this thought primer, enthymemes, these arguments that can be expressed as standard form categorical syllogisms that have an unstated premise or an unstated conclusion.